Welcome to the SwimSwam podcast. I'm today's host, Coleman Hodges. Joining us is Mr. Pullbuoy himself from the UK, Steve Buckley, to talk about British trials, British selection processes, and Team GB heading into the Fukuoka 2023 World Champs. Steve, how's it going?
Good, thank you, Coleman. Thanks for having me on. Plenty to talk about from British trials, plenty of drama in the selection, as you've alluded to already. So, yeah, it's going to be good.
Yeah, so let's start with this. The biggest thing for me and news-wise was, British swimming had laid out this selection process. They have these super fast automatic qualifying cuts, and they have consideration cuts. And then they had left room for themselves to pick 8 athletes, additional athletes on the world's team who hadn't made either of those cuts. Halfway through the trials meet, they have a meeting and they say, you know what, we're going to take that number out. Instead of just 8 athletes, we're just going to say it's up to the discretion of the general manager and the head coach. So they can basically pick however many athletes they wanted. When trials ended and they ultimately picked the world champs team, you had 5 athletes hitting that automatic cut, 10 who hit the consideration cut, and then 14 athletes who were chosen at the discretion of Team GB. What was your reaction? What were your thoughts on kind of them flip-flopping to kind of make up for how fast these selection cuts are halfway through the trials meet?
It was an unusual situation, certainly. I mean, we're used to seeing fast selection times. I mean, we've seen them for years over here, and since Bill Furness and Chris Spice took over in 2013, those times haven't been getting slower. They've generally been getting quicker. So the automatic times they've been ramping up for a long time. But I think when I saw the policy for this year, they were faster, but you were used to that. I think where I was surprised was how fast the consideration times were. They seem much faster than we've seen in the past. And as you say, that kind of is where it fell down, because we always expect to see a small number of people get the automatic times, and 5 did this year, but very few people were hitting that consideration standard. So they were cutting out loads of the top 2 from each event at trials from even being able to be picked, unless they were in those 8 wildcard picks that you mentioned. And yeah, I think there was panic, might be a bit of a strong description for it, but certainly some head scratching halfway through the meet when they realized that they were going to be using up all of those 8 picks to be able to field relays in Fukuoka, which obviously is going to be part of getting those teams into the Paris Olympics, and something that they wanted to do. So I think that was probably, in my view, the reason that they made the change. But I've never seen it happen before. They've always had the ability to make that change, whenever they wanted to, but never actually used it. So a bit of a surprise, bit of a shock, but as things turned out, probably the right call.
So that's interesting. Why do you feel like it's the right call? Especially, I mean, I think it's the right call given the criteria. So I guess let me revise that question. Do you think these cuts, these faster consideration cuts, as well as really fast automatic qualifying cuts, are beneficial to the athletes? Obviously, for Team Great Britain, they seem to think it's beneficial because then they have a little more discretion in picking the team. I guess their theory is that athletes will rise to the occasion, but and eventually get faster as time goes on. Do you see it that way for the athletes?
I think it cuts both ways. I mean, there will be people who are good enough that they don't even really look at the qualifying times. Someone like Tom Dean or Duncan Scott probably, might look quickly, but is not too fussed about it. But then you get a whole load of other people who look at it and think, well, I'm never going to make that in a million years. And it could be quite disheartening. for them. And when you see the qualifying times are faster than the national record, that's people are not reaching those times because they're not trying. People are not just thinking, I'm going to swim faster because I know I now have to break a British record. I don't think athletes' mentality works like that. So I think it goes both ways. I think the performance director and the head coach will point at results over the past 5-6 years as being evidence that it works. And it's you can't argue that Britain's had its best results at Olympics, Worlds in that period with these standards in place, and so maybe it is driving standards up. And certainly I think there's more of an expectation for the guys who get on the team that they're going to the Worlds or the Olympics or whatever to do something and not just make up the numbers, as it were. But I think it's a fine balance. I'm not sure they got it quite right this year.
Yeah, it seemed odd. Obviously, they pivoted, halfway through this trials, and that, like you said, was the right move. But I am kind of curious moving forward if they'll keep that selection process in place, especially for Olympics. It leaves a lot of discretion instead of more of just like a trials, and if you make a cut, you get to be on the team kind of thing, which I guess is a pretty American perspective, right? I mean, that's certainly the way it's been done here for quite a while. I
mean, Britain doesn't have the same depth that the US has, obviously. I mean, no country really does. So you can't set, say, the World Aquatics A time and know that everyone who makes that and finishes top 2 is going to be a medal contender. In the same way that would happen at US trials and maybe in a number of events, in Australia perhaps. But so I think that's why they want to keep that discretion. They want to have flexibility to make up those relay groups with alternates to make sure that if for the sake of argument Tom Dean has a bad day, they can still pick him. Because Britain's got to get those top people to those meets. And so they need that flexibility. But I think where a lot of people feel it goes too far is that perhaps it gives the impression that they've got favourites rather than looking at performance. Now, I don't wholly buy that, but it certainly gives that impression, outwardly when you are picking, on discretionary means.
Right.
Albeit, I don't think they did do that this time at all, really. When you look at the squad that was selected, it's almost entirely a team that would have been picked if they'd just taken everyone who had met the A time. So, they played it pretty straight after all that. They just had to effectively get rid of the consideration time.
Yeah, and so let's go to trials just a little bit. What impressed you, or what stood out to you from? There was a lot of good, really solid swims from veteran swimmers, as well as a lot of really good swims from young up and comers. I mean, Freya Colbert was a standout athlete at this meet. She's only one of the 5 who made that automatic qualifying time. You had a 13-year-old, a 14-year-old winning the 1650 on the women's side. And so what were your swims that stood out the most?
I mean, given what we've said about the qualifying times, the 5 that made it were clearly standout performances. You mentioned Freya Colbert there. She was excellent in the 400 IM. I mean, she had a great battle across 3 events, in fact, with Katie Shanahan, the young Scot, who also had a really good meet, lifetime best and everything. But yeah, they cut sways off their 400 IM time. They made PBs in the 200 back. Katie Shanahan PB'd in the 200 IM. She beat Abby Wood in that one, but Abby was also close to her best. So they were 3 really encouraging events, with 2 great performances, in the first 2 places across all of them. So they were really great to see, and it was interesting to see how Freya and Katie would move on this year, because they've come out of their club programs and gone into the performance center system, and sometimes it can take a little while for people to readjust to that kind of environment, but they seem to have taken it all in their stride and are moving forward rapidly. So they'll be exciting to watch later in the year, definitely at Worlds. And then in In addition to that, obviously the men's sprint freestyle, 200 freestyle was beyond what I expected. I mean, we all know that Britain is developing a bit of a niche in 200 freestyling for men, but that the performances in there were better than I expected, and I certainly wasn't expecting the 100 free to be quite so deep as well. So they were really exciting. As a British swimming fan, that's really exciting.
Yeah, I'd like to take a moment to talk about something you mentioned, transitioning from a club team in Britain to a high performance center. I think the most comparable thing we have in the US is going from high school to college swimming in the NCAA. But what makes you say that can be sometimes a hard transition for athletes to get to right off the bat?
I think there's a lot of the guys go into it where they're at a similar stage in their careers to what you've just talked about. They're leaving school. They might be combining it with studying at university, or they might just be going into the performance center directly. So I think there's that switch from being a student athlete to being a full-time athlete to deal with. And then I think when I've spoken to people about this before, a lot of them mention how it's suddenly understanding that, yes, you're part of a group, but everything's about you now, rather than you just being one member of a squad. It's right, what do you need in weights? What do you need in nutrition? How are we going to structure your program? And it's very much more focused on the individual, just because you're in that high performance setup, and it's different from being in a club where you're one of a squad of 10 peers or whatever. So I think that can be a bit of a transition as well to make. Plus, you're probably training different times a day. Maybe the emphasis of the training is different, maybe less volume, maybe more specific stuff. There's all these things, and they all come at once. Mm-hmm. And I think it can shake people to start with. And we've seen people who've taken a little while to get used to that in the past before they've come good. So, yeah, the fact that those two have made that jump pretty seamlessly was impressive.
It's kind of funny to me because that sounds like the jump that a lot of American athletes take when they go pro, right? Or become transition to becoming a professional athlete, which is essentially what these athletes are doing when they go from their club team to the high performance center. But like we said, the age range there is when athletes here would go from high school to college typically. And in the NCAA system, it's like the exact opposite. You're going into a predetermined system, and you're very much a part of a team. So it's kind of like a club team, but more so. I think college athletes say they cater to individual athletes a lot, and I'm sure they do, but it's like they've already got their system, and it's a group of coaches coaching within that system and coaching the whole team. So it's interesting how different those two systems are, and we've seen both work. And certainly Britain seems to be having success with that system in place as it is. You mentioned the free relays. I'm kind of curious your take on the women's side. It seems like with Australia, US, Canada have all had really strong relays in the last 5 years on the women's side at the international stage and long course. And Britain seems to be always right there, and they seem to be coming up, but kind of always in that 4th, 5th, 6th spot. Do you think this could be a year where they break through and get a medal in the 400 free or 800 free relay, given what you saw at trials?
I'm not sure about this year. It's the thing on the women's side is that there are the sort of frontline quartets in both those free relays are competitive. Definitely, they'll make finals. They'll be 4th, 5th. They might challenge for a podium. Certainly, I remember in 2021 thinking that the women's 4x1 had a outside shot at that podium in Tokyo, and they swam really well and I think 4th or 5th. I can't remember exactly, but what they don't have is the same depth that the men have got. So if someone has even a slightly off day, there's no one to come in and make that up. Or indeed, the top two ladies, Freya Anderson and Anna Hopkin or Freya and Abby Wood in the 4x2, they might get spread a bit thin by swimming heats, finals, all the relays, and then their individuals as well. And I think that's been a factor, certainly for the 4x2, why they haven't been selected. It looks like they'll swim that this year, which is really good. The top 4 at trials were pretty solid, and then Freya Colbert didn't swim that, but is another 157, mid swimmer at least, and probably better than that, because obviously she set best times and everything else this week, and we haven't seen what she can do. So I think that team could take a step forward this year. I think the 4x1 is probably stuck, is maybe the wrong word, but probably still mid-table in those finals, given what we've seen so far. But it wouldn't take much for them to move on.
Yeah, so in that 4x1 particular, at Olympics and World Champs last year, they were 5th. And it seems like at the Olympics, the Netherlands were 4th, but they had Femke and Ranomi, who are now both retired. At Worlds last year, they were 5th. China was 4th. I'm wondering how Canada is going to react to the loss of Kyla Sanchez. And I feel like Penny Alexiak's kind of, we don't know what her deal is, if she's going to be at Worlds or not. And so, it's Anna Hopkin, Abby Wood, Freya Anderson. Is Lucy Hope on the team as well?
She is. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So that was the squad from last year. And it seems like, again, they have an outside shot. And if things fall their way, they were 0.2 off of China's time last year at Worlds, and China was 4th. And then it's a 3-second gap to the US, but again, with Canada kind of being uncertain about 2 of their legs, I feel like there's opportunity there.
Yeah, I tend to agree. And certainly it's a squad that British swimming have taken an interest in, and they've been, trying to put feelers out and get a group of maybe 8 ladies who can be the core of that relay, and from where they can draw them. So I think there are eyes on it in terms of the potential it has. And you're right that with Canada having a bit of a question mark with what they might swim this year, it doesn't take much, as I say. So we'll see, won't we, when we get to Fukuoka, and hopefully they'll swim well, and we can't control what everyone else does, and if they're there or thereabouts, then maybe it will fall their way.
Yeah. And so shifting from what you saw and you liked at trials, what kind of surprised you in the opposite direction? What was lackluster? I mean, for me, I know Luke Greenbake just missing the team completely was a pretty big surprise. I think backstroking has kind of been Britain's Achilles heel, especially on that men's medley relay the last few years. But to see him, who has medaled in the 200 back, I think of the last 2 world champs in the Olympics, to just completely, get 3rd in that event, was a pretty big shock for me. What did you see that was a bit of a disappointment?
I mean, I think that was a disappointment for him, and certainly was a bit of a shock. I mean, there was some talk that maybe he'd been ill, although I don't know. I've not heard that for sure. That was just something that was mentioned in the commentary, which obviously would have affected things. So that was a disappointment. Obviously, we knew that Adam Peaty wasn't going to be swimming, at the trials. So that it's a disappointment, but it wasn't a shock as such. But I think the men's breaststroke without him did seem quite flat. James Wilby is excellent, as an excellent breaststroker, but he wasn't himself. I didn't think at trials. He won the 100. He was a bit better in the 200, but was not at his very best. And behind him, there wasn't the feeling that there's this big rush of people who are going to replace Adam as and when he steps aside. But I may be being unfair. I mean, there were best times from Greg Butler and Archie Goodburn in there. So maybe I'm expecting too much because we've been spoiled all these years by Adam turning up and just being incredibly fast. But it felt a bit flat in the men's breaststroke, I think.
Absolutely. I'm curious how you think So he's officially not on the world's team. I think there was a bit of speculation that he won't swim at trials, but they might select him for the world's team. So we can rule that out now. I'm curious how that might affect Britain's focus on their 4x1 medley, especially because their free relays are looking so stout. Both the 4x2, obviously, where they're, I think, the heavy favorites now, at least until we see the rest of the trials meets. Especially, I think the U.S. is kind of maybe the only team that can challenge them at this point. But they look really good in that. They look really good in the 4x1 free. 4x medley, like, it's at the end of the meet, which I think makes it a little easier to, especially if it's their weakest relay, to kind of just be like, all right, let's see what we've got. But what do you think the makeup of that relay is now, or more of the focus is compared to the other two?
I don't think the focus on it will have changed with no Adam. I mean, obviously, the squad won bronze, I think, at Worlds last year without him. Obviously, James was swimming in that, and as I say, he's a great breaststroker. He's not Adam Peaty, and I don't think anyone would expect him to be. But he's more than capable of filling that leg. Obviously, James Guy will be there for the fly, although Jacob Peters took a big step forward at trials with a 51.1, and that's really important, if nothing else, because it gives a bit of flexibility for the heats. Mm-hmm. So they don't have to swim James in heats finals of the mixed and men's medley relay, and then obviously you can pick one from about 6 for the free. So I think it comes down to the backstroke and which of the guys they've taken can kind of move it on. I mean, Ollie Morgan was the winner in the individual 100. He did a massive PB in the heats, took about second off his PB, 53.7. But he needs to keep moving that forwards if the team's going to be competitive. I mean, Britain hasn't had a 52-point backstroke since Chris Walker-Hebburn retired in about, I'm going to say 2017, 2018, something like that. And that's, having Adam has always not covered up for it, but made up for it, perhaps, because you might lose a second to the US or whoever on the first leg, but you gain a second and a half or 2 seconds back on the breaststroke, and then it's a straight shootout. So it'll be really important for Ollie or for someone like Cam Brooker, who's also been picked in the backstroke, just to keep that moving, or Brodie Williams, in fact, indeed, who swam the backstroke legs at Commonwealth Games, just to get the team off, and hopefully keep pushing their times forward so that the other three can do their business.
Yeah. Just looking at results from last year's Worlds, like I forget that it's really impressive. Britain was bronze in both the 4x2 and the 4x1 medley without Duncan Scott and without Adam Peaty on either relay. Obviously, Peaty wouldn't be on the 4x2, but no Duncan Scott. And they still got great swims out of their guys, Jacob Whittle and Joe Litchfield, as well as Guy and Tom Dean. And then Tom Dean with a 47.4 anchor on the medley. I'm kind of curious, and I don't know if this is his weakest stroke or what, but is there a chance Duncan Scott could swim the backstroke leg on the medley?
I don't think so. No.
Okay.
Frankly, he's so good that if you told him he was going to and gave him long enough, I'm sure he'd be competitive. But I can't see that. I can't see that in the short term. No.
Okay. It's like, yeah, I'm just thinking like, well, if they've got a 53.7 as their best PB right now, it's like, yeah, could Duncan reliably give them a 53 low? And I know they haven't done that before, and yeah, I don't know how explorative they are to that option, but he's such a good medley swimmer and just so strong in every stroke. I was just thinking, what if?
Yeah, I mean, why not? Got to think about these things, haven't you? But yeah, I'm skeptical that would happen. I think it would have been more likely, perhaps, that they would try and convince him to swim the fly, because he's a pretty good 200 fly swimmer. But obviously, I think with James and Jacob now, it's probably less requirement for him to do that anyway. But
sure,
yeah, he'll be battling it out to try and get on that freestyle leg, because that's not going to, for the medley relay anyway, because that's not going to be straightforward.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and again, they're 4x. I'm really excited to see their 4x1 free. I feel like they went for it in Tokyo. and it kind of just came up short of a medal. I think last year, was kind of a down year with some guys being out and some guys being in for Worlds and focusing on comm games. But then I feel like after that trials final, I think they could top the podium if not everyone else is on their game.
Yeah, and having followed British swimming for a long time, the prospect of getting a medal, let alone the gold in that event, is astonishing. Frankly, I mean, for years and years, we couldn't get a guy who could swim sub 50. And even going back, I think it was 2003, I want to say, before we had the British record was sub 50, and even going back to when the current performance director and coach came in, nationals in 2014 or 2015, whenever, was won in something like a 49.3, and that time this year would have been 13th or 14th, in the heat. So it's really moved on. And we're in a lucky period that the 4 fastest 100 freestylers that Britain's ever had, in fact, the 5 fastest 100 freestylers Britain's ever had, are all swimming now. And, and 4 of them have PBs at a sub 48. So it's, I have to keep making sure I put a lid on it and don't get overexcited, because otherwise I'll end up being disappointed when they with whatever they do at Worlds. But it is, incredibly exciting. I've said that a lot in this conversation, but that one really is, exciting.
I mean, I think for me, it's the most exciting, just because it seems like they've put an emphasis on it, and you've kind of seen the progression in the last couple of years. I said they took an off year last year. They got 4th last year by less than 0.2, and they set a national record at Worlds. So they were not off, even though they were not fully loaded. Right. And like you said, 4 guys all have PBs under 48. 2 guys have been sub 47 from a relay swing. So it's like, they look really good. So I'm excited to see that race in particular for them moving forward.
And I think the other thing is the depth that was visible at these trials. British swimming has been burnt a couple of times, and this relay in Tokyo was one of them, where they've trying to manage people's workloads and stuff, and they haven't quite got the heat selections right, and they were 9th in Tokyo and didn't make the final. But the depth last week was such that I think they've got much more scope to not take so many risks, if you like, because the risk is that much smaller of not swimming your top 4 in the heats. So it should be good.
Absolutely. Well, Steve, I appreciate you taking the time to sit down and dissect British swimming. It was an exciting trials meet to watch, and it certainly got me pretty excited for Worlds moving forward. Do you have any parting thoughts or any other wisdom to share before we sign off today?
I think this year will be interesting in the context of Paris, of course. It inevitably will be, but I think you spoke at the start about what that might mean for selection. I think the results this year will make a big difference as to how they approach selection for Paris. Obviously, the relays, will take care of themselves in terms of whether they get high enough results to some extent. But I think that might affect how they go about it, and it'll be interesting to see when the names come out who they pick for the other meets, particularly the European under 23s, because there's a few people who could have gone to Worlds who didn't get the nod, who may pop up in that team. So it'll be interesting to see how they approach that as well, but that's not out yet. But be an interesting meet to watch, just for who might be bubbling under and who we might see break through for next year's Olympics.
You've been listening to the SwimSwam podcast. Stay tuned for new episodes every week. You can take SwimSwam podcast on the go by subscribing on your favorite podcast platform. Look for links in the description below, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more videos as well.